right, so welcome everyone to our second What Physicists Do of the spring semester. It's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Daniel Hernandez, who is a medical physicist at St. Luke's Cancer Institute. So Dan got his BS in both math and physics at Cal Poly. I'm trying to let people in at the same time. He got his PS in math and physics at Cal Poly, and then went to San Francisco State to work on a master's degree in physics, which is where actually I met him. So talk about you never know where your physics career is gonna head. Dan and I worked in the same research lab while he was a master's student and I was a bachelor student. Now he's a medical physicist, I do quantum gravity. So who knows what the future holds. But so after his time at San Francisco State, Dr. Hernandez started a PhD program at UC Davis. And during that time, he also received a certificate in medical physics from the School of Medicine at UCLA. And then after completing his PhD, he moved on to he did a residency at Davis, and then now is a medical physicist at St. Luke's. So welcome, Dan. Thank you so much for talking to us today.
Great. Thank you, Alex. Can you hear me okay? Great. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you again, Alex, for hosting this, putting this on, putting this together, and thinking to invite me. It's a real pleasure. So yeah, as Alex was saying, I had a long education, a long run-in with education over the last several years, finishing my doctorate. I'm going to go through a little bit of this, but finishing my doctorate and residency, and now I'm up here in Boise. I included kind of a showcase picture of Boise here in my cover slide. And it's really an incredible city if you haven't checked it out. One thing to note here is there's a crane in this picture, and now if you look at Boise skyline, you see about 5 to 10 cranes at any one time. There's an incredible number of people, primarily from California like myself, that are moving to the area. So I highly recommend getting up and checking it out. So let's see, there we go. Again, my talk's gonna be primarily geared towards undergrad students. So I do wanna talk a little bit about my path. I share potentially a similar background as some of the students at Sonoma State. Similar in some ways and incredibly different in others, and we'll go through some of that. But I do think it's important. I remember as an undergrad coming to some of these talks, and you get to see a lot of perspective from other physicists and academics that have had a fairly linear path. They've gone straight through from high school to their undergrad degrees and doctorates and whatnot. And I think that I have a slightly different perspective to offer there. So I'd like to share that. Obviously, we're going to talk about what medical physicists do and how you become a medical physicist, especially to the undergrads, if you're interested. And then I'll touch a little bit about some of the exciting things coming to the world of medical physics. So, as I was mentioning, typical path, fairly linear and homogeneous, very common. And this is, if I was to use a metaphor, this would be it for my path. So I'll talk about some of these things and kind of hit some of the highlights and key points along the way. So out of high school, I ended up in this city. If you're not familiar, this is Phoenix. And while this is a pretty nice picture, this is more representative of what it felt like for me coming from the foothills of California. I ended up going to a trade school out of high school and to become a BMW mechanic. This brought me to San Luis Obispo, beautiful place. can't speak highly enough of it, but I ended up in a very academic town with a university there, as we all know, Cal Poly is there, and as well as a community college. And being a fairly young person myself at the time, I engaged in that and I wanted some of that. So while I was working full-time at BMW, I started attending Cuesta College down the road, taking some night courses, and eventually, after a couple of years, I transferred up the street here to Cal Poly. I came in as a math undergrad and eventually added a minor in physics, and then I just really got sucked into that and really enjoyed it and stuck with it. So I ended up adding a double major, as Alex was saying. So if I had to reflect back on maybe one key thing that I got involved with that really changed my trajectory and influenced where I am today, this would be it. I got involved in a research project. And as an undergrad, I really didn't know what that meant. I don't know that my contribution was largely impactful, but nevertheless, I got involved. I kind of put myself out there, and that had that it opened a lot of doors for me, especially coming out of my undergrad. So yeah, looking back on that, that was kind of a turning point for me. After my undergrad, I ended up in San Diego. I decided, well, I knew that eventually I wanted to go to grad school, but I didn't know exactly what I wanted to focus on. And I don't think I had enough direction at the time. So I ended up working for a private research group. This is HLS research. It's heat, light, and sound, largely working with government contracts. We were doing sonar work. And at the same time, I was taking some classes just down the street at Scripps Institute Oceanography, doing physical oceanography. So that was very similar to the work I was doing with HLS. I stayed there for almost a couple of years and was able to turn out some research, again, looking at sonar and some of the impacts on marine mammals. So at that point, I started thinking again about grad school, and I had a couple feathers in my cap. I had some work with HLS that I thought would open some doors, and again, the research that I was involved with at Cal Poly. So I started looking north to California, and I thought that I would be a very competitive candidate for graduate school at the universities we all are familiar with. And I was very quickly rejected. And these were the only two places I applied. So I was very confident in myself. But I think I let that get a little, I was a little ahead of myself maybe. So as a quick backup, as Alex mentioned, I ended up at San Francisco State, worked in the same lab as Alex. And it was a great experience. We were a very active lab, very research focused. And again, I was able to get involved with a bunch of projects that produced some publications and was a really great experience. Here's a picture, I don't know, 10 plus years ago now, myself, Alex here in the middle, and this is Dr. Peng Zhang. And this is a research competition at San Francisco State that I think Alex and I both won our respective divisions. Is that right, Alex? I know I did.
I think so, or at least honorable mention from you.
Something like that. We did well. We did all right. So anyway, yeah, it was a great experience, and that launched me into my next round of looking at graduate and PhD programs specifically. And I applied, I was accepted a lot of different places, and that felt great. And I was still rejected at the same two places I was rejected at the first time. Nevertheless, I ended up getting into UC Davis's PhD program. They have, if you've never been to the campus, it's actually a very nice campus, and they have these little heads, statues all over the campus. And I can't remember the story behind them, but if anyone is familiar with UC Davis, you've definitely seen these. So, yeah, so now in my PhD at Davis, I was in the laboratory of Dr. Zhengdong Zhu, doing optics work, similar to what I was doing during my master's. And partway along that path, I actually, I'll back up a little bit. I was very interested in medical physics coming into my PhD. And the reality is that I really didn't have any idea what that meant. I think part of me thought that, I could be involved in maybe creating some new technologies, working for a medical device company, something like that. So after I finished my coursework in my PhD in physics at Davis, I started taking some courses in biomedical engineering. I got involved with, it was basically a seminar course at UC Davis's Cancer Center in radiation oncology. And that was really the part that kind of defined, set the path for where I am today. I had some incredible mentors there. It's a much different type of field than traditional physics, in the sense that, you go in every day and everybody there, everybody from, all the technologists to the physicians to the physicists, everyone there is on the same page and they have the same goal in mind, and that's to help the patients. And that's a real special thing. And I hadn't really experienced something like that before. So looking forward to become a medical physicist, and I need to qualify that. There are lots of medical physicists out there, but everything I'm going to be talking about today is specific to board certified medical physicists. So these are people that, like myself, that work in clinics, that go through the process of getting board certified. And in order to do that, you need more than just the degree. You also have to go to residency. And for me, that meant I had to go back, kind of backtrack a little bit, and go to UCLA, to their School of Medicine, and get a certificate as a 2-year certificate course from the School of Medicine, specific to medical physics and radiation oncology. So it's interesting to look at this slide, and there was a point in all of this where I was writing my dissertation at UC Davis. I think I was taking maybe one seminar course at maybe in biomedical engineering, I can't remember, but and then I was also attending my certificate courses remotely at UCLA. And I distinctly remember this day where I'm writing my dissertation, I'm attending my courses at UCLA, and I'm stuck in the bathroom of a hospital, in the hospital, because we had just had my son. So this was all in the last year of my PhD. So this is my son, Mathis. He was born back in May in 2017, and my dissertation. But so that brings me to medical physics specifically. And so as I was saying, completed my residency. I started in 2018. It's a 2-year program. It's pretty typical length. There are some programs out there that go 3 years, but for the most part, they are a 3rd year of research. So, and it's, again, they're not too common. Mostly medical physics residency programs are geared towards getting people like myself familiar with life in the clinic, what that means, the patient interaction, and taking that knowledge that we've gained from our masters, doctorates, et cetera, and being able to apply that in a very real and hopefully meaningful way. So, first lesson learned. So when you come to a fork in the road, take it. I can look back at a lot of these different forks that were put in my path, and I looked both ways at each point, and I chose a path. And I think for the most part, I never looked back. And I went into that yeah, I guess I don't know a good way to describe it, but I committed to that, and I'm very glad that I did at each point. So the point of the talk, what do we do? So if you're like anyone else in the world today, the first thing you do is you go to Google. Excuse me. So if you're an undergrad and you type this question in, the all-knowing Google really understands that you're not concerned about with the question at hand, what medical physicists actually do. What you really want to know if you're considering going into this field is, what am I going to get paid? So this is actually what popped up for me when I searched this. So what is the medical physicist salary? How do I become a medical physicist now that I'm convinced that there's money to be made, or that it's a lucrative path in some way? Are there actually jobs? Because if there aren't jobs, then the salaries are irrelevant. And once you realize that, yes, we are in demand and there's a good career path here, then you can commit to actually looking at medical physics programs. So these are typically high yield slides, especially with undergrad students. They want to know, okay, if I'm going to commit myself into this field, what does this actually look like? So here's a couple. This is from a salary survey, national salary survey of medical physicists in the US. And there's a good distinction to be made here, or something to note. As I mentioned earlier, there is a certification process, a board certification process that is important. Now, there are some hospitals that will hire medical physicists that have not passed their board certification, but by and large, they're in the minority. So you can see here, 8 to 1, and again, 9, 10 to 1 for masters. And this is also important to, especially for the undergrads that are listening. There is a pathway with just a master's into this field. The challenge being that residencies are getting very competitive. So as an undergrad, if you're considering going this route, if you look into this field and you decide this is something you want to pursue, you need to know ahead of time that this is more of a challenge not having a PhD. That doesn't mean it can't be done, and it certainly is done every year. And there are residency programs that focus on master students, but they're the minority. So they're very competitive programs. And I'll speak a little bit to the numbers as well.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
For those masters, were those specifically masters in physics, do you know? Or
yeah, it's a very good question. So there are two different routes you can go. You can get a degree in medical physics, and there are medical physics programs. So it can be master's or PhD level. And there's a organization that's basically gives them a credential. So it's called a CampEP certified master's or PhD program. And actually, I have a couple slides on this towards the end. So there are different routes you can go. It doesn't have to be specific medical physics, but it does need to be something in the hard sciences, typically physics. Some biomedical engineers, those types of folks, can go down this path with the right amount of training. Good question. All right, so beyond that, is there demand? In short, yes. There is a bottleneck right now that they're trying to resolve in terms of residency programs and getting enough residents out to replace aging and retiring baby boomers. So there is a big demand. There has been for, I think, several years. And it's not at a critical point where patient care is necessarily being sacrificed, but there's a demand and there's work out there. All right. So again, in terms of board certified medical physicists, I'll remind you of that qualifier. This is the breakdown. So radiation therapy and specifically radiation oncology, about 85% of medical physicists end up in this field. There's a smaller subset in diagnostic imaging, radiology, about 10%, and again, an even smaller subset that go to nuclear medicine. Go ahead. Alex, you had a question?
I think we lost you for, oh, maybe it was just I who lost you for just a minute. I'm not sure if it was your end or mine, but could you repeat yourself one more?
Oh, yeah, no problem. So again, just the breakdown, about 85%, the vast majority in radiation oncology, 10% going into radiology, and then 5% or so going into nuclear medicine. And each one of these subspecialties will have its own board certification process. Okay. Alex, is the audio still coming across okay? Great.
Yeah,
okay,
I think it might have been my end. So
okay, that's okay. So again, looking back at this, I'm going to talk mostly about radiation oncology specific, because that's the field that I work in. I think I have a couple slides about diagnostic imaging, but we'll see if we get to those at the end. All right. So radiation oncology, what is the goal? So I'm going to take a step back here, and it's important to understand what we're trying to achieve, and before we can kind of understand some of the complexities of it. So in general, so this is a fibrosarcoma that we're looking at. And in general, what we're trying to do is deliver high energy radiation deep into a person's body, sometimes very deep into a person's body, and target that such that we are damaging the DNA within that cancer cell. So cancer cells have essentially gone haywire. They replicate, oftentimes uncontrollably, 2, 3, 4 at a time, and they take over vital blood supply, et cetera, in the body, and to the detriment of healthy surrounding tissue. So we're delivering this high energy ionizing radiation, and we can do damage to that DNA by 2 different mechanisms. One is a direct hit to a DNA strand that kind of breaks it apart and damages it so that it can't be, so it can't go through a replication cycle and divide within a cell and continue to grow. So that cancer cell gets stopped dead in its track, so to speak. And then there's indirect radiation. And it turns out that this indirect radiation that I'm showing here is the more common mechanism for doing damage to DNAs in cancer cells. So a high energy photon comes in, it interacts with the water molecule, and there's a few different things that happen, but basically you can have free radicals and other ionizing events that can do damage to DNA within that cancer cell. And kind of the interesting part of this is that these cancer cells in general are not very good at repairing themselves when they've had damage due to radiation, when they've undergone damage due to radiation, whereas normal tissues are a little bit better. So this graph on the right kind of summarizes that in a nutshell. So on this y-axis, we're looking at the surviving fraction. So that's cancer cells that will survive radiation damage. So we deliver a little bit of radiation damage, more tumor cells or cancer cells will be killed off, essentially, will be eradicated. And in the same time, fewer normal tissue cells will be damaged. They are able to repair themselves better, whereas cancer cells cannot. Then we deliver a little bit more radiation. So this would be a typical, we call it a fractionation scheme, or kind of a treatment model that we follow for patients. They come in every day, they get a little bit of radiation, and we're we're taking advantage of this biological response to radiation. So we get a little bit of a window or separation in the number of cancer cells that are surviving. And every time we come in, or the patient comes in and receives radiation, more of the cancer cells are being damaged than the normal tissue. So that's radiation oncology in a nutshell. That's really the goal. So just to summarize in two different bullet points here. So we're trying to simultaneously deliver sufficient radiation to eradicate all cancer cells. We can't leave any behind. That's not the goal. And we also need to simultaneously minimize the dose that we're delivering to surrounding healthy tissues. So where does the physicist fit in? It's fairly intuitive, I would say, to walk someone through, a layman that's not familiar with radiation oncology, to walk them through this flow chart that we're looking at. So I'll just do that. So a patient comes in, they see a physician, maybe it's a primary physician, they send them over to an oncologist or a radiologist to have some imaging done or to have some sort of treatment done. And then from there, there's some support staff that help deliver that treatment. It can be, radiation technologists, therapists, dosimetrists. So dosimetrists are the people that actually come up with the plans for us for radiation therapy. And then they follow up with their oncologist to see how things look. Maybe they have some more imaging done, and then that gets reported eventually kind of at the end of this care path back to the physician, and then they monitor from there. So from there, it's not clear where the physicist fits in. And this, especially in radiation oncology, is kind of captures that nicely. It's a little bit more complicated, but by and large, we come right in between the oncologists and the folks that actually go and deliver that plan. And there's a reason for that. The oncologist is very familiar with the amounts of dose and kind of the amount of radiation that they want to deliver to a patient. But it's not until we start planning that and really looking at the details until we know how much of that normal healthy tissue that we're trying to spare, that we're trying to minimize that damage to, we don't really know that information ahead of time. So the physicists will look at this, they'll look at the radiation oncologist's goals with the plan, and they'll help make some of these decisions in terms of which type of radiation might be most beneficial to this patient, what energies might be most beneficial, and different types of modalities that we can deliver that radiation. So there's a lot of nuances to this that that the physicist, I can't even say it, that the physicist is experienced with and trained to address. Moving forward here, we kind of work together with the rest of the support staff to make that happen. There's also a tangential area to all of this that this doesn't capture, and that's that we're treating patients with very high energy linear accelerators. So we're putting patients in front of linear accelerators that have lots of moving parts, lots of moving pieces, far more than any linear accelerator that most physicists are familiar with. And that, in the research setting, you have this linear accelerator, maybe you shoot it at a target of some sort of sample, a material, whatever it is you're trying to study. And that's all that needs to happen. Well, of course, you need to image it or collect some data. We have a patient that is has a lot of stuff going on. They're breathing, their hearts are beating, they have sensitive organs that we're trying to spare, and we have this big linear accelerator that's moving around them in real time, delivering radiation in real time, and there's lots of moving components. So it's our job to make sure all of that comes together on the day of treatment and deliver what we expect to deliver. This is a typical linear accelerator. So these are very small compared to what you might see or think of in the research setting. This is historically was referenced as a L arm or a C arm linear accelerator. The L being going up and down, and then arm coming out. There's also an imaging panel that can come out here, so people will reference this as a C arm or an L arm linear accelerator. This will move around the patient. I have a video that I'll show you shortly that kind of demonstrates that, but this moves around the patient and delivers radiation. Here I have a cross section of a patient where they're treating for some sort of lung tumor. So the trick is to get as much dose into this lung tumor that's seated deep in this person's body and minimize the amount of dose that you're bringing through all of the sensitive organs surrounding it, right? So it became, obviously, if we start coming in from a lot of different angles, that means you're giving a lot of low dose to all this surrounding area and a big, huge, very high dose to the tumor itself. And there becomes a trade-off at some point. How much low dose is okay to give to surrounding healthy tissue, and you have to balance that with the amount of dose that's needed to actually kill this tumor, to shrink it, eradicate, whatever it is, whatever the goal is, that you're trying to achieve. So from the physicist perspective, we have different forms of ionizing radiation that we can consider. So obviously photons, high energy photons, electrons or protons. The minority of these in terms of cancer treatment is far and away protons. So protons are a highly specialized form of radiation therapy. It's very common for pediatrics. And for reasons we're seeing here on this curve. So this is a depth, we call it a depth dose curve, but as you go deeper into tissue, so depth in the x-axis here, so here's 10 centimeters, 20 centimeters, and this is just the relative dose being delivered in that tissue. So as we go deeper into tissue with protons, you get a very big spike at a relatively localized region. So this allows you to pinpoint where that radiation is being delivered and deliver that very specifically, very locally to tumor sites, disease sites. That's great for pediatric patients, especially because they're smaller. Their anatomy is very tight compared to ours. So there's a very simple physical reason why people might favor protons for pediatric patients. That being said, a lot of the vast majority of patients are treated with photons or electrons. If I had to guess, it would be somewhere on the order of 80 to 90% photons, a smaller fraction electrons, and maybe less than 3%, maybe closer to even less than 1% patients being treated currently with protons. So we are involved with a lot of those decisions and what might best suit the patient. All right. I just put these here, quick reference for the physicists in the audience. So this machine, this is a very common type of machine. These linear accelerators will produce photons and electrons, both roughly in the 6 to 18, some go as high as 20 megavolts. We refer to photons in the megavolt range or electrons in the mega electron volt range. So just for reference, the radiation that comes out of, say, a diagnostic scanner, like a CT scanner or a traditional kind of X-ray, like if you were to break your arm, something like that, that's going to be down in the tens of kVs. So maybe 10 kV, or sorry, not 10, 60 kV to 120 kV. So we are orders of magnitude larger than that. Another slightly less common type of linear accelerator. This is a tomotherapy machine. This looks very similar to a CT scanner. Here, the linear accelerator is kind of all under the hood, and they're able to achieve that because they're only single energy. So this one in particular is a 6 MV, relatively low energy linear accelerator. But the benefit that it brings to the table is that it will treat and deliver radiation kind of in this helical fashion as the patient is moving through the bore of this machine. And that allows you to treat very long lesions or areas of disease in a relatively uniform way. Whereas the image on the left, the first linear accelerator I showed you, the patient's not moving while the beam is on. So you're a little bit more limited in terms of the size or number of lesions that you can treat on a patient in one go. And finally, we have, and by the way, these are all, each of these three types of machines that we're looking at are modalities that we had at our disposal at UC Davis while I was doing residency. So I got to become very familiar with each of these. This last machine is, it's called an Electa Icon, but the radiation, rather than being, having a machine that produces the radiation, like the linear accelerators in the previous two photos here, these are actually fixed radioactive cobalt sources, so cobalt 60. And the ionizing energy, the energy itself is significantly lower at 1.25 MV. But that being said, you're able to get many more sources into this. So this particular machine, I believe, has 296 radioactive cobalt sources, and you can control sets of each of these. And this is just a cross section, but this is really like a big hemispherical dome that goes around the patient's head, and that allows you to treat very localized, very kind of focal, very small lesions within the brain. And we're talking lesions down to the kind of millimeter scale. So that allows you to really pinpoint these things. All right. So moving on, in terms of some of the more technical details, a lot of what we're looking at as physicists is, on this left slide, you see this very bright spot within this patient's lung. And we are very concerned about how quickly that dose falls off. So ideally, we want a lot of dose to a tumor site, and we want a very large gradient and very large dose fall off as we move away from that tumor and into healthy tissue. So that becomes very tricky when you have patients, well, patients in general. It turns out patients really like to breathe. That's important. And when you breathe, or when your heart beats, et cetera, things move. So we're trying to deliver these very large dose gradients and trying to keep them down to somewhere on the order of millimeter type of precision, but you have patients that are moving. So we look at, as physicists, we look at different ways that we can really focus in and target that lesion effectively, whether it's through simple techniques like breath hold. We can also kind of gate the machine or turn it on and off with their breathing cycle, and image in a variety of different ways, and sometimes even image in real time as they're being treated, as radiation's being delivered. So there's a lot of complexities that go into that, that we as physicists are concerned about. So I have a little clip of a linear accelerator in motion. before we watch this, keep in mind, as you're watching this, keep in mind the number of moving parts that are in motion as radiation's being delivered. This light field that's shining down here on this table, normally we would have a patient here. I think the video actually has a simulated patient there, but think about the fact that we're trying to just focus that radiation on a disease site in the patient. And as this linear accelerator moves around the patient, the profile of that tumor is going to look different depending on the angle that this linear accelerator is kind of looking at the patient or coming at the patient from. So everything needs to be moved. The shape of the field that we're delivering needs to change. And all of this is happening while the patient is locked down as tightly as possible and constrained from moving. Yeah, so keep that in mind. We'll go ahead and. All right. So everything I've talked about so far is delivering radiation from the outside into a patient. The additional kind of modality that we have at our disposal is brachytherapy. And that's where you're actually implanting radioactive isotopes, these little seeds. Like you can see it here on the top left image. It's about the size of a grain of rice. And you can go in, this center image shows a typical prostate patient being treated. You can go in, insert a needle into the prostate gland, or maybe it's a breast patient, whatever it may be, drop these seeds in and pull it out, pull the needle back out, and those seeds permanently stay in place. They have a typical half-life, so they will decay away and then they're no longer radioactive. And the majority of this radiation is delivered very locally to within the first couple centimeters. So as physicists, we're able to look at this and say, okay, based on this person's anatomy, this is how many seeds we need to deliver. This is the type of isotope. This is the amount of radiation I want out of those seeds, et cetera. I've also included here in the top right a handful of the most common isotopes that are used. Sorry, I lost my mouse there. Most common isotopes that are used for radiation therapy. And then on the bottom right, we have an image of a prostate patient with all of those seeds actually implanted. And some of them will tend to migrate to different, migrate out of the prostate on occasion, but that's not a big deal. Like I said, after within a couple of weeks, most of that radioactivity is gone and the patient is no longer radioactive. All right, so in general, the role of a therapy medical physicist, such as myself, all comes down to quality assurance. So everything that I talked about regarding the machine needs to be addressed. We bring in these new machines somewhere on the order of $5 to $7 million machines. We do all of the quality assurance checks on them. We have to collect all the beam data on those and then put them into a software, our treatment planning software, so that we actually know what we're trying to model and how we can simulate that on a patient. So there's a lot involved with that. These machines typically last somewhere on the order of 10 to 20 years. And so that machine needs to be monitored constantly. We check our machines daily, kind of a rudimentary output of the machine. We check them on a monthly basis, and we even check them on an annual basis. And from year to year, these machines vary. Well, we have a tolerance that we allow them to fluctuate, and it's our threshold is 1%. So they have to remain constant in pretty much all of those parameters that we just saw, all of those things that we're moving, all of the motion of the gantry and the leaves and all of that stuff, in addition to the energies itself and the actual output of the machine to within 1% year after year for up to 20 years, which is a pretty remarkable thing that they're that stable. Likewise, on the patient plan side, we work together with the physicians and the dosimetrists that come up with the plans, offer suggestions, and some of the more specialized plans we even create ourselves. In vivo dosimetry, so occasionally we have specialty cases that need to be measured. So we're in the clinic with the patient and setting them up and taking actual radiation dose measurements during their treatment. Then there's continuing kind of follow-up care for our patients. We have our chart rounds that we go through on a weekly basis just to check in on the patients, make sure that everything is being delivered as scheduled. We review all of the imaging for the patients. We image the patient. Some of these patients get imaging every day to make sure that they're in the exact position that we think they're in when we go to deliver that radiation. And then more on the academic side, if you're at a teaching hospital, you have a research component. And all of that is very simply, any kind of research that you're going to do in radiation oncology is going to have a clinical impact in the end, hopefully, and improve quality of care for the patient. So all of this has to do with quality. This was a research project that I got involved with at UC Davis. There are specific types of disease that, just take this gentleman, for example, a very aggressive form of skin cancer. This gentleman was inoperable for a couple different reasons. And so he got treated with external beam radiation therapy. The problem with this high energy radiation is that most of that dose is delivered at depth. So it goes into the patient a little ways before that dose actually comes to a stop and does damage. And that's not what we're trying to achieve with a patient like this. We want all of that dose to be delivered at the surface or at the skin where the cancer is actively growing. So what we do is we looked at some technologies, and 3D printing has reared its head in a very promising way in all kinds of different fields. And we made use of that. So this is a mask. We're kind of looking from the top down on this bottom left image, but you can see some metal shields that we kind of built into the mask to shield the patient's eyes so we don't damage those. And then we have effectively a bunch of fake skin. The rest of the mask just acts as, we call it a bolus, but it's basically just fake skin so that the radiation goes through that artificial layer of skin. That dose starts to build up there, and then it peaks right when it hits the actual patient's surface so that we can maximize the radiation that's delivered to the patient at skin level at the cancer site and minimize what's being delivered below that. There's a handful of new technologies coming out. The top left picture, I seem to have lost my mouse, but oh, there it is. Maybe not. It's okay. Top left picture. Especially for those that are joining us from the physics community, you see things in here. Let's see. So in that picture, there's a treatment beam that they're referencing, but there's also a 1.5 Tesla wide bore MRI. So this is an MRI with a linear accelerator built into it. So they're imaging in real time using an MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, in combination with a linear accelerator right outside of the bore of this MRI. So this was a real novel idea that people came up with years ago. But as we learned in our first year of physics, that having electrons accelerated in close proximity to a magnetic field is a bad idea because they bend, they change their trajectory. So this company in particular, ViewRay, found a way, basically figured out how to design this linear accelerator while still being in this magnetic field, in this MRI machine, and they're able to get this incredibly high resolution MRI images in conjunction with an active linear accelerator delivering beam in real time. So that's a really remarkable feat when you think of the basic physics of that. The top center image is also a very similar machine, but they're using cobalt, I believe, in this. So no linear accelerator. The top right is a technology, it's called CyberKnife, and this is a big robotic arm. Again, this is a single energy, I believe it's 6 MV photon energy. And this robotic arm moves around the patient at all different angles to deliver radiation. It's a pretty remarkable thing to watch in place. Very futuristic looking machine. And then on the bottom here, we have two more diagnostic imaging types of technologies that are coming out. On the bottom left being a representation of the Explorer image that was developed, Explorer PET scanner that was developed at UC Davis. I have a video of that coming up shortly. And then also, this was a project that I worked on for a little while. The bottom right, it's called the Abalone. It's another full body PET imaging technology that the idea was that it would be developed at a fraction of the cost of a standard PET imager. Other kind of future of medical physics type of topics. So very promising flash radiation. This has been developed just in the last couple of years. And it's essentially identical to everything I just described, with the exception that the dose that we deliver is 200 times faster. So if a typical treatment might take a minute of our time, with flash technology, it's 1/200th of a minute, whatever that comes out to. It's very fast. And it's very interesting because we're delivering, these researchers are delivering the same amount of dose, but they're just doing it much faster. And if you look at the inset, this kind of top right plot, you see the red line going across the top. That's the percent of survival. So basically, all of these mice survived having cancer and were given this very high dose or very rapid dose, I should say, of radiation. And whereas all of the mice that received the same amount of dose, but it was delivered much slower, all died. So 10 days later, they're all dead. We don't have good answers for the biology around this. There's a lot of people that are looking into this, but overseas, they have started treating patients on a very selective process, started treating patients, and these are primarily going to be palliative treatments. So patients whose disease is terminal, it will kill them, and we're trying to these researchers are trying to see if this indeed has the same result that they hope for. So it's promising technology, very early on in its development. As a resident, I got to attend a lot of his talks, so it's pretty nice. So just real quick, I'll talk about routes into medical physics programs. I mentioned some of this already, so we can go through this kind of quickly. On the left-hand side, we have a more conventional path. So bachelor's in physics or engineering, and then you go through this CampEP, as I mentioned earlier, CampEP graduate program, master's or physics programs will qualify you, and then into a residency. And with that residency, you become eligible to take your board exam. My path is the alternative path. So PhD in physics, and then you have to go through this certificate program to get spun up basically in medical physics. That's what I did at UCLA, and then a residency, and then board certification. Quick slide. So these are the residency programs. So the red indicates basically the number of students that were matched into residency programs. We're currently at about 130 to 140 positions per year nationwide. And then, of course, in the blue, we have some that don't match, and will either come back next year and reapply or go into an alternative pathway. So with that, thank you very much, Alex, and also thank you to my mentors. I think I may have at least one or two of them out there in the audience today. On the left, this is a particularly special picture of mine. The left image there as we're looking at the image, Dr. Robin Stern, she was a mentor of mine at UC Davis, radiation oncology, perhaps one of the best physicists I know. And to the right was a huge mentor of mine as well. Earlier on, Mr. Stan Smith, he was my high school auto shop teacher that taught me a lot about life skills. So thank you all and thank them. And with that, we'll turn it over to questions if we have any.
Thank you so much, Dan. I'll clap on behalf of everyone.
Yeah. I see hands clapping. That's enough.
Yeah, thank you. That was so interesting and so excellent. So if there are any questions from the audience, you could raise your hand or you could type them in the chat. I see right away we have a question from Scott, so maybe we'll start there.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. Thank you so much for joining us today. That very great talk. Every time we have a medical physics talk, I'm always amazed at this combination of medicine, but our field of knowing knowing about radiation, about paths of light, about particle accelerators, and making it in such a practical thing. Without being any more effusive, let me say that what was funny is I have recently seen a streaming ad repeatedly for the CyberKnife, and I was going to ask you about it, and I felt like awkward, like, do you know about this thing called CyberKnife? But since you mentioned it, it does seem to me like there continues to be abilities to move this forward. There's getting and knowing the dosimetry and working with existing technology, but then there's moving the technology, like you were talking about with the 3D print, changing where the radiative energy is going, or something like the tomography and knowing how to plan and hit it with a new device, right? So can you talk about, is there a field, when we think of a medical physicist, I do think we think of the people assigned, attached to institutions for delivering the care, right? But would you also say, what would you say is the field available for people? Is that the same group that's being tasked to give feedback to companies in making these new devices, such as the CyberKnife?
Yeah, so I think I can address your question in mostly with regards to my experience at UC Davis. So what really stood out to me when I started my or actually even before that, I started getting involved with some research there before my residency. But it really stood out to me that, it turns out all of these vendors, a lot of these companies that are developing these technologies, they're always missing the one important thing, and that's the patient. They can have a company that develops a technology, but until they can see that in action with the patient, see the clinical outcome, they don't know how to move the needle. So they really rely heavily on academic teaching hospitals to interact with, to have that feedback, and really to have that clinical experience. So again, I mentioned this earlier, having that clinical knowledge, it takes a little while for physicists to acquire that, but once they have that and can make that bridge between the technology and the physics of the device and what needs to happen in the clinic, that's an important piece of all of this. So having these companies come in, interact in a very real way with primarily teaching hospitals, but sometimes other hospitals as well, is crucial to all of this. I don't know if that addresses your question completely, but
no, it does. It's really there are people coming up with clever ideas, but they need the interaction with the in-clinic physicist who can see both sides of it at point of care.
Absolutely. Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. So we're over time a little bit, but maybe if we had one more question, especially if a student has a question, but if anyone else has a question.
Yeah, I have a question actually.
Great.
So when you were showing those graphs of how the cancer responds a little more negatively to radiation versus normal cells, I was just wondering how you guys take into account the potential cancer that's being induced by radiation therapy.
Yeah, this is always a big concern, and that's a very real concern. It's one we address, and this basically comes into the decision-making process in terms of how much radiation we're going to try and deliver to the disease, and how we're going to balance that with not only sparing healthy tissue. So I mentioned that, and I talked about that at great lengths, but at some point you run the risk of inducing cancer from excessive amounts of radiation. And that's where clinical trials come into place. That's where early phase trials come in, animal-based trials come into place, and really understanding the risks associated with that. So it's very difficult to, well, it's not difficult, it's impossible to put a specific number across all disease sites and types of cancer. But by and large, the amount of radiation that we are delivering is more unlikely to induce cancer than it is to save a patient from their current cancer. So it's a very real concern. But it's one we don't take lightly, and one that is well understood at this point. So it's a good question. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you again so much, Dr. Hernandez. That was really excellent. Thanks for also sharing about your journey. That was definitely interesting to me. I'm sure everyone appreciated it.
A little unconventional, but it's been a fun ride.
Yeah, no, it's great to hear about. All right, so thanks everyone. Next week, we will hear about black holes. So the woman who will be speaking to us actually worked on the Event Horizon Telescope. So I'm sure she'll talk a bit about that and about what she's been doing recently. So it should be a really fun talk next week. So thanks for coming, and thanks again, Dr. Hernandez.
All right, thank you, Alex. Appreciate it.